back when I did a lot more work with Art Review magazine, and Art Review publishes this issue every November called the Power 100 issue, right? Which like presumed to rank the 100 most powerful people in the art world, right? Everything from museum directors to gallerists to artists and things like that. And it's actually now an interesting artifact to go back and look at and see how the sensibilities around what made for power changes over time, right? And it's like, oh, at one moment it was like all of these fancy dealers and collectors were at the top, and then the next moment it's like all of these fancy artists are at the top and thinkers and other people. But I remember for a long time to be on these telephone calls with people like, well, how are we defining power this year? What does it mean? What does it mean to be powerful in this world?
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the MO Podcast, where we interview changemakers building ambitious and big projects in the art and cultural sector. My name is Joey Flores. I'm here with my co-host, Jonathan Neal. And as always, this month, we have back in the studio Rocket Caleshu for our Roundtable Recap, where we talk about the most recent 3 episodes of the podcast. Those include an interview with Sara Fitzmaurice, founder of Fnnch & Co., one of the leading strategy firms in the art and cultural sector, as well as author and historian Justin Jacobs on his novel Plunder, How Museums Got Their Treasures, and street artist Fnnch, whose iconic honey bears are scattered all over St. Louis and San Francisco, as well as the rest of the world, about his solar-powered sculpture at Burning Man this year. So without further ado, Rocket, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to see you both.
You too.
Hey, Rocket.
I think this is probably the most diverse 3 episodes we've done a roundtable recap on. Usually they have either had like some kind of linkage to them. They're all musicians or music industry people or artists or gallerists, etc. So 3 very, very different episodes. So I suppose let's just start at the top. The 3 episodes ago was Fnnch with the honey bears and the solar bridge, which was his solar powered sculpture that he built at Burning Man this year, fully self-sufficient, using the power of the sun to power the sculpture. So Rocket, why don't we start with you? What did you think about the Fnnch episode?
Well, I grew up in San Francisco and spent time also there in my 20s, and I remember just seeing the honey bears everywhere. So it was like also just fun to hear from the source, because I actually didn't even look into who. It's like that thing about street art is like the kind of wonderful thing about it is it both it's really particular in its authorship, but because sometimes it's so present in the public space, you don't even consider where it came from. It like does a funny doubling around authorship that I appreciate. And I was like, oh my God, the honey bears. Yeah. And it had never even occurred to me to like consider who made the honey bears. So I was like happy to hear from Fnnch and kind of like hear about like sort of his sincere approach to making making public art, essentially, to making sort of like unpermitted public art, which I felt like it just had a different flavor to it than sometimes like graffiti art or other kinds of like street art, there's like a disruptive quality inherent in it, but that he also approaches it like as, his serious yet anonymous public art career. And I appreciated the way that he kind of delved into the background of how he built that up and how he made that possible and how it started the small seed. But it wasn't like he was just like a teenager out with a like can of spray paint, no shade to that. That's an amazing thing to be. But like, he had sort of more of like a vision behind what I got from it was that he was really had an idea of building a career essentially, or building a practice, maybe more importantly, building a practice through like public intervention. And so it was cool.
Yeah, for sure. I think we've been talking to Jonathan and I've talked to Fnnch before, and I think we've probably been talking to him for 2.5 years actually. And what's interesting is he sort of, got up and off the ground, doing, unpermitted public art, and started with a handful of things, and then ultimately found some traction with the honey bears. And but then he became sort of a master of getting wall space in San Francisco. He's incredibly good at convincing people to let him paint murals in the city, which has not been without controversy. He sort of dominates the SF landscape, probably gets more wall space than just about any other artist there. He's not from San Francisco, so that's been a bit of a point of contention with other artists in the city, feeling like he's just his art is everywhere. And I think at the end of the day, they're a little jealous that they can't seem to, find their own wall spaces, and permits to be able to create the art that they want. But yeah, I mean, he's grown it into a really tremendous practice. Jonathan and I, a couple of weeks ago, went to his studio and checked it out, and saw all the work that he was creating for Art Week in Miami. And yeah, it's quite a big operation. He's got some pretty robust equipment there, and a number of different assistants that help him at this point. He puts out a Honey Bear of the Month every month, which is a limited edition series of paintings that you can buy, prints. Well, no, I guess not prints, but reproductions, so to speak, that he creates. So anyways, yeah, he's definitely like transformed being a street artist into being, sort of a pretty well-known muralist. He's now doing that in St. Louis, which is where he's from. But he's put these things all over the world. I think that he was talking about, he's done it in Tokyo, he's done it in other places. So yeah, pretty fascinating to like see somebody take it and just turn it into like a well-oiled machine. Jonathan, what did you think?
I thought it was interesting because I think one of the things that we got to see and also talk about was this kind of also shift of his, he is the kind of like the Honey Bear operation, but then also these large scale public projects that have kind of been road tested out at Burning Man, and the move away from those more kind of iconic works that he's known for to things that are a little bit more abstract. And so I think the Solar Bridge itself is kind of interesting in terms of his desire to, create a self-sustaining work of public art for Burning Man that then, had its conditions and constraints that he had to follow, different from the things that he's made in the past, where it's like, he's got, again, that big dancing man, but whatever, I can't remember the name of those things, but those big like balloon men that car sale dealerships have outside to like draw people's attention. And he had a big one of those out on the playa. But realizing like, oh, you got to have a generator and an engine, and there's all this gas that has to be trucked in, and everything, all of the kind of non-aesthetic elements, logistic elements that go into producing this thing. He was like, all right, how do I make a self-sustaining project? And I thought it's very interesting to see how those types of problems lead to new creative solutions or new creative outlets for an artist, where often people think it's like, oh, just the kind of pure creativity of the artist in the studio, thinking about ideas and previous art, or other kinds of aesthetic problems that they might be trying to work through, where in fact many times the solutions are driven by much more kind of mundane logistics, but very real on the ground conditions that they're trying to control for. So Solar Bridge was very much a solution to those set of problems, the contingencies of trying to put something out on the playa that doesn't require constant maintenance or constant upkeep, or the trucking in of gallons and gallons of gasoline or whatever else it might be in order to do it.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually like something we've talked about in the past, which is, a lot of times we think of, we might think of the size of a painting as an artist's choice based on, just whatever they thought was going to be the most striking, visual representation of the image that they want to create. But, it turns out that they had to think about, like, could I get this through my studio door? How am I going to transport this? Or like with Bart Van Peel and the whale, thinking about how we need to rebuild another one that will fit in a shipping container as opposed to the first one, which did not. And even, as Fnnch was saying, he took 200 pounds, two batteries, each weighing 100 pounds, to store the solar energy that was collected by the panels. And turned out that was far more than he needed. So, here he is carting in, I think, 1,000-pound sculpture, or however much it ultimately ended up weighing, and also because of these batteries. But then learning, when he's there, that's just a lot more power than is needed to fuel this thing. So I think there's just like these interesting learnings that, that then you get to apply to the next thing.
Right. And noted that he hadn't seen solar powered work at Burning Man before, which I'm like, so amazing. It's like, that's crazy. Like, it's so ripe for it. And that, he actually saw that through, and kind of sounds like was the first person to do the problem solving around the very particular conditions of, the limitations of being at Burning Man, but also the incredible possibility. Like, of course, solar. Oh my God, you're like in a desert for days.
Yeah.
Utilize harness.
Yeah. Well, and also really interesting to hear from his perspective. It's like you go to Burning Man, and it's like, all like there is like daytime Burning Man and nighttime Burning Man, right? And nighttime Burning Man is like a world of light up constructions, right? Like, I mean, it's like a carnival-esque type of place where it is all of these things lighting up to light people's ways, to create attractions, to light the various different camps, to light the various different sculptures. But and then it's also generators, right? Like it's also this like all of these, gas powered, diesel powered generators that are the the infrastructure of what's happening there. And there's something very fascinating about just that as a kind of system that to try and think through. It's like, all right, how does one deal with those constraints and figure out something that's going to be self-sustaining? Because he also is like, listen, it's like, batteries are super heavy to try and haul in and haul out, and so having everything out there be sort of battery operated, solar powered is itself a kind of logistics problem in terms of the weight and the shipping cost and everything would be to try and bring more of that infrastructure into the playa environment.
Yeah, I think I really hope that like more artists take a cue from this, because to be honest, when you're out there at Burning Man and there are these generators, they're noisy, they're putting off, fumes and things like that. You've got a cable running from an art piece over to a generator so that the generator is sort of out of the purview of the piece so that you can enjoy the piece and you're not standing right next to the generator. But, like having cables running, 20 feet away or whatever it is also not ideal. People are riding their bikes around at night. It's, like one of the great things about the playa is it's a completely flat and rockless environment, which is really amazing. Like when I got there, I was like, why would they want to throw an event like this out in this dusty, terrible place? And then one night, as I'm riding my bike at 2 o'clock in the morning in the pitch dark and realizing that there's not a single stone on the entire playa, it's 100% flat. There's no dips, there's no bumps, there's nothing. It's completely flat, completely without anything that might, take your bike down or whatever. So to have a cord going from, an electronic sculpture of some kind to a generator or something like that is just like not ideal. So it's pretty cool that, you figured out a solution for having this thing, and all that is there is just the sculpture itself. And, you have no idea how it's being powered necessarily, but yeah, it would be nice to see a lot more people start to incorporate that so that they don't have these generators out there. I mean, both for ecological purposes, but also just because it's like, not the vibe to be, riding your bike around a bunch of generators.
Yeah, I can see that shifting in the next few years because there's some initiative that's being run within a handful of states and actually departments of education. They're building electric school buses, basically. And think about the size of a school bus and electrifying those. They don't have to go super long distances. They have to basically be you can charge them up. They have to go around, pick up a bunch of kids. I mean, and then they can be plugged back into the grid and recharge, and then they do their routes and then they're done. But one of the upshots of this is that you basically what the school bus ends up becoming, rather than just transportation for kids, is in its downtime becomes a mobile energy unit, right? Like you can drive that school bus to some place and then you have a ton of excess energy and it can be used as basically a mobile backup battery. And they're thinking about this in terms of first responder resiliency, after various different challenges that any kind of locale might face. It's like you have this big fleet of basically mobile batteries that can be fully charged and ready to deploy at a moment's notice. And then, of course, if you have a solar panel array that you can like pop on the top of that thing with an inverter, then potentially you could roll those things out into the desert and you've got, self-recharging like major battery hubs that could be used for a big thing like that. So, you roll like 50 of those school buses out to the playa, you spend money on it, but it's like all of a sudden you've got this like ready to hand energy source that's renewable. And then, maybe Joe, you still got the cables that are all going to be running from this, big energy generating source, but you could just put up some signs to make sure no one does a front flip over their handlebars on the bikes.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it would be nice to have that as a renewable energy source, but yeah, it doesn't solve the cable problem. But
doesn't solve the cable problem.
this is like way off the beaten path here, but I talked to a guy last year, and apparently, like at oil drilling sites, there's this byproduct, some kind of gas or waste that they have to pay to get rid of. But it is usable, but they don't really use it. They just pay to like go dispose of it somewhere. And what they did is they built a whole business where they would build these semi trucks, and inside the semi trucks were all these computers that were mining Bitcoin, and they would pull and they created converters for this fuel byproduct within the truck, and they would just go park these trucks at the oil pump and take all of this byproduct, put it into the truck, use it to mine all this Bitcoin. So, the company is now saving money that they were going to have to pay to send this stuff elsewhere. And this other company is getting free fuel to do this very fuel intensive Bitcoin mining and making just, money hand over fist. So definitely interesting to see what people do with these alternative energy sources. Yeah.
That makes me feel like I'm melting. I'm like, what?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's go the opposite direction of a Burning Man, and have massive tanks full of Bitcoin.
It's like accelerationist man, right? Like it's
full accelerationist man.
Full acceleration. Amazing. Turning natural resources directly into digital finance.
Literally, it doesn't even leave the site.
Literally, like, yeah, exactly. It doesn't even leave the same place, but it's like a one-to-one transformation of dinosaur remains into, Paleolithic dinosaur remains into a digital currency.
Yes.
That is a very strange timeline.
Amazing. We should say that the good news, Fnnch told us that they were working on a long-term loan of the solar arch to the art installations in Golden Gate Park. There's this thing called the Golden Mile, which is one of the streets in Golden Gate Park that runs along I think it's like the north east corner of the park. And Solar Arch, I think, has been installed now as one of the very first works that you confront when you're entering the park from the east. So anybody who's listening who happens to be in the Bay Area has an opportunity to go and see it on the JFK Promenade, or one of their first installations on the JFK Promenade in Golden Gate Park.
Wow.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Found a home for it there. That's cool.
Yeah.
It was funny because I mentioned to a friend of mine that I had gone and visited Fnnch's studio while I was in the Bay Area, and then we went to an event or that we were going to go. And then we went to an event at Emporium, which is a massive arcade place that you can rent out for parties. I'm sure that's open to the public when there's not parties. But anyways, I walked in, turned to the right, and immediately there was a big honey bear holding a pool stick and an 8-ball in its hand. And I was like, hey, that's the guy. That's the guy whose studio we're going to go visit. So yeah, the honey bears are truly everywhere.
Saturation point is impressive.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just think it's cool. It was like Fnnch was saying, lots of artists donate pieces to charity auctions and things like that in order to raise money for good causes. But, and maybe there's a little bit of a relationship. Maybe if it's an ecological thing, they might pick an artist who kind of focuses on those themes. And then there's a painting of like the ocean or, whatever, some kind of, it might be fitting for the charity that they are donating to. But Fnnch's honey bears just lend themselves to these, for him to put these costumes on them and these props with them and things like that make them like completely, of the brand of the charity he's working for. So, he's raised money for firefighters by putting, fire hat and everything on the honey bears. I think he did something for breast cancer and created a pink honey bear. And so pretty cool that his style and the honey bears lend themselves so easily to, being able to contribute to those things and actually make them like relevant. And, I would imagine if I'm going to a firefighter fundraising thing, rather than, just, I don't know, a painting of a forest, which is tangentially related to fires or whatever. There's the honey bear with the fire hat and coat on, and I just feel like I would be more, if I was really passionate about that particular cause, it would just I would be more interested and driven to purchase something from a charity auction if it had something to do with the theme itself. Shall we move on? Next thing.
Sure.
Let's do it. Let's get into it. Rocket, We know you've got some opinions here. Next one, episode number 17, interview with Justin Jacobs, author and historian, on his book Plunder, How Museums Got Their Treasures. Justin Jacobs' narrative in the book Plunder is that although there have been a lot of treasures from various communities that have been, picked apart, stolen, and plundered over the years, quite a lot of his research found that these things were bought and sold or given away by diplomats as, the items to be traded for social capital or political capital and things like that. Rocket, why don't you tell us what you think?
Okay. I think I felt that, I guess my initial feeling was I felt, and Jonathan, you had asked this question quite directly, and I didn't quite get the answer from Justin about sort of extrapolating out the research from his area of focus in China into other colonial contexts. So that was maybe my primary question, was how, of course, like the Chinese relations with the Western world, I think we can't entirely reproduce that set of relations and place them onto other colonial relations. So while I was quite intrigued by what he had found in his research, and it seemed to me quite, quite legitimate and airtight, and I think I was excited to hear about sort of the way that the objects were treated as part of daily life, and that there were colophons, and that there was engagement with the objects both as spiritual objects, or as gifts to the people that we want to impress or that we love or whatever, and that those, to kind of parse those relations, was very interesting and exciting to hear. I think I just lost the way a bit with it when I felt like we were kind of extrapolating out the entire history of the colonial project, as if we could look at his research, which is what it is, and is very contextual to where he's conducted his research, clearly. I felt a little unsure that we could really extrapolate out as if that was representative of all the relations, or as if we could then use that to say that asymmetrical power relations are simply the nature of the human condition. That to me just felt like really murky territory to try to get in, and I appreciated when he stayed close to his own historical research. And then he really lost me on some of the kind of what does this mean about the academy, or what does this mean about art institutions, or what does this mean about how we characterize the nation through these questions of restitution. It felt like it just got really baggy for me, and I appreciated when he was reviewing his own research, but some of the ways that he was drawing conclusions felt like it just had this ideological stake in somehow proving that we're off the hook for the sort of outcomes of the colonial project in a way that feels not warranted by the research that he was doing. And I unfortunately missed the screening, but it comes out next week. But as I was listening to your conversation with him, I, that same day, had read The New Yorker just published a profile of the filmmaker Mati Diop, and she made this film called Atlantiques that's really quite incredible, that really blew my mind a couple years ago. And her new film comes out this week, and it's about the restitution of these particular objects. So it's just very interesting to kind of, I had no knowledge of Justin's work prior to listening to this conversation. And so just to have this conversation placed right next to Mati Diop's conversation about making a work about the restitution of these particular objects that belonged to a pre-colonial African kingdom, and then were returned to the nation that now exists, where that pre-colonial kingdom no longer exists, from France, where they've been held. And to kind of put those side by side was a very interesting experience. And I haven't seen the film yet, but I'll see it when it comes out next week. But just reading, getting a lens, getting a look into her lens of sort of, she'd initially said that she wanted to write a fantasy that imagined the life of these particular objects, but then it just so happened that restitution was happening on these particular objects around the time that she was doing development on this film. So she actually had the opportunity to work with an actual instance, historical, modern historical instance of restitution. And that for her, the restitution in her words, has become like a synecdoche for creatively empowering like actual currently contemporary living African youth. And the way that she phrased it was that she wanted to make a film that would restore, quote, our desire for ourselves. So that there is actually a contemporary, a really pressing contemporary political concern around this question of restitution that doesn't require us to sort of tie it up that whether or not it's good or bad for objects to stay where they are now, or to somehow try to resolve that the way they got there was morally bankrupt or morally acceptable under the market conditions that existed in that period of time. And so for me, it was just interesting and fruitful to get to look at these two very different perspectives side by side. And so I think the timing was kind of right on that. And maybe the timing of this conversation is kind of right, because there are, and he is addressing a lot of these contemporary questions around the restitution piece. But I just ultimately felt like he really got in the weeds for me on the argument that essentially to me said, well, listen, there's no fundamental, one way that I could construct what he was saying was, we have to move away from the idea that there's a fundamental problem with Western imperialism. Or again, he did not say that, but like the derivation of some of these questions that like, as if people didn't resist as if resisting colonialism is not something that we can measure, the way that we can measure like an archaeological dig, or the way that we can measure looking at the colophon of particular objects, did not resonate for me.
Yeah, I think that I think you're right to point out that there's definitely an ideological bent. There's an argument, right? It's more like it's a polemic that's being backed up by a certain amount of historical research and a different historical perspective than I think is coming from more of the analysis of the last 25, 30 years, which is focused on, say, the Elgin marbles as the kind of the big case of a sort of inter-European restitution case of a kind of, difficult sort, that has been squarely in the sights of not just activists, but as sort of like a major political upheavals in European politics, certainly even since the 1990s. Then I think there's also been this larger project in the kind of decolonial strain, which has looked at particularly West Africa and the Benin bronzes and cases of full-on looting and plunder of artifacts that were taken by colonial activities over a couple 100-year period. But what I think is interesting, and so I think we would do well to remember that those are cases that are sort of given. I don't think that there's any argument against them, but there has been, I think, a sense of the way that those conversations have filtered into the larger public or even academic discourse is of a kind of like everything that a museum holds, especially of a kind of archaeological nature, is now suspect, right? Is should be examined, and that's probably the case, right? Like it all probably should be examined in terms of like what is the condition of like these museums, and I'm making this argument from someone who's like, I actually think that a lot of the rationale for museums themselves as a kind of state actor and an exemplar of a cultural heritage is itself kind of suspect, right? There's a lot of stuff that museums do and the way that they act, not in any individual case is nefarious, but just like as an entity, especially in this sort of contemporary digital age where it's like you can have high fidelity images, information, discourse, archives, all this kind of stuff available to everybody all the time. They make it very difficult to get that stuff. One, two, you could be making high quality copies of all of those things, holding them in your archives and then giving them back to people who want them without any kind of big issue. It's not a value issue because you're never going to sell the things anyway, blah, blah, blah. So I think there's a whole sort of argument to be made that the museums need to be rethinking, their practice to begin with. And I think they are doing that. But what I appreciated about Jacob's book is that particularly this vantage point of China, right? And I think that this is something that comes, rolling down the hill towards any number of arguments about the sort of decolonial project and the relationship of a kind of the West to the rest. So that China presents a particularly unique but massive case study of, a different type of history, a different relationship to colonial patrimony, a different relationship to to cultural heritage. And Jacobs has the goods on that, right? He's got a very deeply researched understanding of what that looks like within the Chinese historical context and the modern Chinese historical context. And it is not a corrective so much as it is and I'm always in the favor of this, a complication of what would otherwise be a more simple view of the way that things operate. And I think that is the important thing that Jacob's book brings to the table, is that, in fact, there's a larger complexity to the way a lot of this stuff has circulated around the globe in the last 150 years, and it's worth looking at that. But I do take the point that, against the background of the 19th century colonial project in particular, there are relationships of diplomacy and of market factors that need to be looked at in their specificity, because against that background, there can always be a kind of asymmetry of power relations and asymmetry of market relations and asymmetry of diplomatic relations that, may or may not have been there had history operated differently, or was there a different narrative to tell. That said, history is what it is. And I think it's interesting to go in and say, look, the dealer, right? The artifact dealer is not always some like nefarious, top-hatted, solely always self-interested character who's just interested in like screwing over one party to the benefit of somebody else. Maybe that's just 95% of the time, but 5% of the time, maybe there's something different going on. But I think that, it's interesting to look at who these characters are, and I think Jacobs does a good job in a relatively brief book of bringing these categories forward in terms of dealers, diplomats, and other ways of seeing these things circulate. Now, I even in the chapter on Egypt, I could definitely see a whole bunch of people coming back and saying, look, right, like this is a crazy moment in these, what were not even countries at certain points in these regional histories, right? These were, parts of these empires that were then in decline and being split up by other colonial powers. And what does that look like, especially into the period in the early 20th century when, between 1917 and the 1940s, like, there are countries that were literally just like drawn on the maps out of nowhere and, have no relationship to, prior histories, boundaries, peoples, languages, cultures, etc. And so what does it look like to be claiming certain legal or juridical legitimacy or validations to transactions when they don't respect or have any, at the time, did not have any of the historical nuance that we hope we wouldn't be looking at these things today.
I'm curious, Jonathan. I have to admit that I didn't read the book, which anybody who knows me will not be surprised by. But
just doesn't read. Jesus. Isn't that what ChatGPT is for you? Come on.
I read a lot, just not a whole lot of books. Articles, other things. But I'm more inclined to write something than I am to read something, which probably isn't the best approach either, because it probably shows in my writing. But anyways, so I have two questions, because I know you did read the text. So and I'll just name them both off. So one, do you think that, was there a really narrow focus on a few regions that, sort of supported this idea that, that it was all fair game with these artifacts? And do you feel like those particular regions might, I don't want to say like cherry picked, but, that those regions, the narrative that these things were not plunder is maybe fine, but that as Rocket said, maybe that was extrapolated out to represent this practice of the acquisition of antiquities on the whole, when maybe other regions it was not so clear cut and there was a lot more plundering. Do you think that maybe the focus was narrowly on places where the argument holds up better? And then my second question is, he talks about China sort of having this approach that if you find something ancient in the ground, it's yours to do with what you want. That would mean that, having these dealers in antiquities is a very acceptable thing, right? These things get found. China doesn't claim to to have a monopoly on everything that's discovered under the soil. And so, if people want to trade these things, sell them, et cetera, that's totally fine. But, did the book talk at all about other regions and whether or not they have similar thought processes, or if there are regions that, actually think that if you find these ancient things under the ground, it's your responsibility to like turn them over to the community or to the state or what have you?
I mean, I think I wouldn't call it cherry picked, but I think that the examples that obviously Jacobs is bringing to the fore are, and I give him credit, the question of Egypt and the Middle East more broadly is pretty tricky territory, right? And so not shying away from looking at that as one of the examples of trying to make an argument for diplomacy and diplomatic activities being one of the main drivers of these kinds of cultural artifact give and takes. And there may be other historians and other people who want to make some arguments about, hey, listen, that diplomacy does not take place against a neutral background, right? This diplomacy is taking place against the background of the Ottomans wanting to make good with the British in order to fight with their neighbors. And so these types of larger geopolitical relations are very much something to be considered there. But I think the question becomes, okay, is there any diplomatic activity in that case that isn't subject to similar type of analysis, doesn't take place against the background of some sort of neutral set of characteristics? And in any environment, the question is, all right, what is that give and take helping to solidify, either in terms of alliances, access to natural resources, access to ports, access to transportation and circulation routes, all these types of things. So I think that that was not cherry picked. Those examples, I think, were brought forward as trying to be very strong examples of what he's talking about, of these alternative ways of thinking about how cultural artifacts make it into Western museums or move back and forth across these national boundaries, other than simply being stolen. Now, I think the case of West Africa, the Benin bronzes, and a larger share of what you might be looking at, there is very, and he's quick to admit, right? He says, listen, there are serious examples of those things being straight up stolen, right? Like, that stuff should be returned. I'm totally on board with that. I think he would say that we need to be looking at, but not taking those as the examples that prove the rule, that say, look, this stuff was straight up stolen, which means all this other stuff is straight up stolen too. And then I think the Chinese example is, again, for me, so salient, and it can't be cherry picked because it's China, right? I mean, it's the longest running, advanced civilization on the planet. 5,000 years of history, like, far outstrips anything that we've got in the West. And so it's an example that's always worth looking to in terms of understanding what a major culture, long-standing, long-running, deep historical culture understands about its relationships to these types of cultural artifacts and its own history, is always going to be a signal example that one can turn to. And so I think that's actually probably the strongest part of his book. And then in terms of comparison, everything else, no, he doesn't offer a kind of like, appendix that's like, here are the cultural property laws and considerations of all of these countries side by side, right? Like, here's the way that everybody sort of considers these things. And I think that's, any historian is trying to tell a story at some point. And so you're trying to pick your examples in order to provide, strong understanding of the arguments that you're trying to put forward. But I think in that case, he's trying to, as against a binary for a lot of people that may look at, stolen, not stolen, or plundered, not plundered, as like the binary that someone might be looking at. He's trying to say, all right, let's add some more categories to that: plundered, gifted, bought, and I can't remember the other one. Whatever other categories there might be, and see what other kind of relationships govern the way that those objects move around the globe. And I think very different is that, we're looking at, I think the irony that he tried to point up, which I don't know if it's a full irony, but it's certainly is interesting, is like the desire for cultural artifacts and for the possession of them to establish a kind of deep history of a place is an interesting kind of there's an interesting argument there that's about a kind of, let's say, a Western scientific view in terms of a persistence through history of a singular identity of a people and a culture that runs counter to, I think, other interesting ideas about the heterogeneity of a culture and the flux of a region and the people, and not trying to go to sort of essentializing ideas about what certain places mean or what certain places are about or what certain people are and what certain people are about as defined through these kinds of artifacts and how those people identify those artifacts as being important to them. That said, those arguments are always for those people to try and hash out for themselves and never for others outside of those communities to try and hash out, but it's always an interesting perspective to bring.
One thing I found interesting was this idea of cultural continuity and cultural discontinuity that, he didn't use America as an example, but I will. It's like, if back in the 1800s or 1700s or what have you, we had some artifacts from, Native Americans, like we might, readily give them away to, diplomats from another country. Oh, look at, this is what the indigenous people use here. These arrows or these tools or axes or what have you. And we might, not really think that much of it because, well, frankly, if it's white people giving these things away, then they don't have any emotional attachment to these artifacts. But now, cut to the 2000s, and we look at Native American history as very much a rich part of the history of the United States and everything that happened there, and being able to show those types of artifacts as well as an important part of the development of the United States or what have you, becomes more important. But at the time, probably not every arrowhead was something that somebody would ever come think about putting in a museum, right? Or every piece of jewelry that was taken off of some Native Americans or something like that, might have just been looked at easily as something that can be traded for value of some kind, whether it be diplomatic or monetary value, because it's not part of the European culture that was important to the people who maybe had those artifacts in their possession. So I find that interesting that these nations go through these cycles where they're majority Muslim and then they're not, and then all of these things, and so at the time that these things were traded, they just might not have been of cultural relevance to the people in positions of power, and I thought that was an interesting thing to think about.
Right. I mean, the argument of in Egypt, like the history of a pagan past, which is like seen as valueless to a contemporary Muslim society with its ban on images or its larger iconoclasm, and so there's a certain kind of governing environment that's like, look, like this stuff's. You want this? Great. Like, we don't want it. Take it off our hands. Like, we can get rid of this stuff, right? It's like, it's like free stuff on Craigslist. They're like, we don't want it. And so it's like, one person's trash is another person's treasure. And this is, but then it turns out that, 150 years down the line, someone's like, whoa, wait a second, right? Like that was important stuff. Or by the sheer fact of its endurance through time, it becomes important stuff. And someone else realizes there's a claim to it. And then there's a different way of thinking about that cultural material. I think it's a really interesting argument about how this stuff works over time. All of it is sort of suffused with politics of one sort of another, right? I mean, it is, what's interesting, I think, about this is that it is so much it is not the artifacts themselves. It is the politics and the power relations and the sensibilities that surround those things, investing them with certain significance and how they are being traded within those networks of significance, right? And how those attitudes change based on conditions and the various different players' makeups, right? Like who they are, what's important to them, what they're trying to get out of it. And as like in all of these things, it's like diplomacy is this just like weird scenario where you think that you're doing something nice and great, and it turns out that it's going to be nice to the wrong people, and is going to screw up some other relationship over here, which ends up screwing up some other relationship because that one has to do with shipping corridors or security treaties or anything else like that. And so how do you thread the needle on who doesn't get their feelings hurt, or how I mean how do you have a relationship with Taiwan in the in the current political climate, without getting in the way of these entrenched economic trade relations that your company or your region may have with China, right? Like you're the mayor of a major metropolitan center in the United States. And yet your aides are like, we don't say the T word around here because that's going to screw up the 20 companies that have relationships with China here who know that they can never mention that word as something other than like, part of mainland China, right? Like it's crazy, complicated, and sensitive. I and I and I think we do a disservice thinking that it's only more crazy and complicated in our present moment. I think it was just as crazy and complicated 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 200 years ago when people are trying to think this out. We may have access to more information and it may be speedier, but I think the complexities were just as kind of sensitive and difficult and as complex as human beings have a tendency to be difficult and complex.
That may be even more difficult because there's less context, less history, less information.
Right.
It would be more difficult to really research things or to really know, what it is that you're getting involved in.
Right. More chance for misunderstanding.
Yeah, I have a question that I'll pose to both of you, and Rocket, maybe you can go first here. But I guess the question is, there is a pretty dominant narrative, or at least it seems like there's a dominant narrative that a lot of these antiquities were taken or coerced away from people or whatever it is. And I guess the question is, as a historian and an author writing a book like this, first, is it enough to present a counter argument and mostly facts supporting that counter argument, or is that irresponsible? And if you're going to write a book that questions a narrative like this, you have to take an approach that really covers all points. Or is it okay as an author to write something that has a viewpoint and tends to focus on contradictions to the dominant narrative, without giving I'm not saying he didn't provide enough supporting evidence or examples of things that were plundered, and maybe he did, but I guess the question is, more from a hypothetical standpoint, as a historian and author, is it okay to write something that just questions the dominant narrative and provides counter examples, or does it need to be a well-rounded work in presenting all viewpoints in order to be sort of a fair, responsible, piece of, journalism? Rocket, what do you think?
I don't have an answer to that question, but I do think, I think that I really just want to echo what you just said, Jonathan, which is like, it was just as, if not more complex in whatever past moment we're looking at. So to me, maybe the question is more like, well, what are the complexities of this moment right now? Which I know is not what he's asking because he's a historian, but I will just ask it, which is like, is it possible to redress the fundamentally coercive project? That to me seems like that when Diop is like, I'm making a movie about restitution, because to me that stands in, part for whole for like the creative capacity of like, like the African youth who like are going to be my descendants someday. That's the question she's trying to ask. I don't think like, which is a question of, is it possible to redress that which was the harm that was done? And so to say like, is the, I don't know if arguments need to be well-rounded or not. I don't know. I think that like that all of these arguments have like fundamental just ethical stakes. So I think it depends on how you want to interact with those ethical stakes, because it is complex, it is political, but the politics also represent real lived experience of many, many people. So, there are the question to me is like less like, can you present sort of an argument from one position? Of course you can. If you're clear about the fact that you're engaging with ethical stakes no matter what you end up with. So I don't know that I'm like, it's not that I want the work to necessarily be more well-rounded. It's just that like I think my position is simply different.
Yeah, I think
as the primary historian and author. Well, actually, I mean, Rocket's also an author, but PhD in art history. What do you think about the responsibility to write a thorough analysis versus
well, listen,
something?
I think Jacobs has. I think Jacobs has. I mean, this is no one can write the universal history, right? Like these are always by their dint. The process, the methodology is going to be partial. It's going to be informed by certain ideological positions, methodological positions, and certain ways of thinking about the material. I think that what you have in the background, and we didn't talk about this a ton on the podcast, but what you have in the background are people like Dan Hicks, who has written this book, The Brutish Museums, about the Benin bronzes, and is extremely critical of the of British collecting institutions in history against the background of this colonial project. But also, I think probably does a little bit more. What Rocket would like to see is this kind of this bringing in of a sort of larger ethical frame under which one would want to pursue these types of research projects. I think there's a lot of room for someone to come in and say, okay, that may well be the kind of the ideological position that one wants to argue from, right? In terms of sort of putting the ethics first and the historical methodology subservient to that. I think that there's plenty of room for historians to say, all right, well, you've got that type of history on one side, and I'm going to give you a different type of history on this side. And I'm going to give you some other examples that are not necessarily simply counter examples, but they just provide a different picture of what was going on. And that provides narratives that are important then to take into account, then considering, okay, how does one then think about that within the sort of ethical frame that Rocket is describing, but also how does one answer to those complexities when making arguments about a certain way that museums need to be behaving, collecting activities need to be behaving, these cultural artifacts need to be observed. I think the restitution question is one that is different from the history of how these objects found their ways to the places that they are, right? Like even if some of these objects found their way to these museums as diplomatic gifts, as bought and sold, right? I think that there still may be very good arguments from a different perspective that say, hey, listen, that's understandable. We understand that, like, the people that were in power in a certain period in time and place decided that they wanted to sell you this stuff. But, now we would like it back, right? We don't think that sale was legitimate, or even if it was valid in a certain sort of legal historical framework, today it is a very different story, and there is a different way that these things are considered. There's a different importance and different value that is put on them. And these things should not be sitting, 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 miles away inside of your storehouses. They should be back with us and our people, et cetera. Those arguments have to be made. And I think that there are probably very good reasons for some of them to be made. There are probably very good reasons for some of them to be heated. But I think they have to be taken on on the merits on their own as cases to be looked at, because again, there's an immense amount of complexity in all of them. And people want to do, I think in large part, I'm fairly optimistic. I think in large part today, people want to do the right thing. They're just, faced with incredibly complicated scenarios that they've got to deal with. And so you see, different reactions and different ways of behaving.
I don't think in late October 2024, like a week before the election, we should say everybody's got great intentions. After watching the Madison Square Garden rally last night or whatever,
Yeah.
So
I'd say the people that are in places to like actually deal with these things, right? The people that are actually placed to like have a conversation, to like meet the parties involved, and like I think there are the people that are involved in those conversations, to the extent should be having those conversations in good faith, well-meaning, good intentions. They can have well-meaning, good faith disagreements about history, ethics, whatever it is that you want to do, but those things should be met in a in a situation of sort of good faith adversarial argumentation and see how they can come out. What doesn't help is, you know, the nonsense that we've had, like you say, at Madison Square Garden and everything else, where it's literally like bomb throwing, grenade throwing, bigotry and stupidity that's being just like lobbed all over the place to satisfy the like most knee-jerk stupid reactions that people can muster in their contemporary moment.
You know, I guess at the end of the day, you mentioned this other book by Hicks. You know, I'm sure, you know, I'm sure he did not take the time to write a completely rounded piece that also includes all the diplomatic trading and the whatever else. You know, he's focused on a particular transactions, or you know, and what have you. And I think if there's like a lot of books out there that you know are covering a particular narrative, then to write, you know, something that points out other cases or what have you without necessarily going into the details of like every counter argument against your own argument or whatever, is just not necessary, especially if it's been, you know, if all those examples have already been well documented, but you feel like there's a gap in the lexicon, right?
It's adding their voices to the conversation and doing it again in a you know, he's written an entire book that takes a lot of his own historical knowledge and experience as well as adds new to the field and has put it out there for other scholars then to pick up and argue against, argue with, argue for, and so on and so forth. And it continues, you know, and the larger project is to assume that you're in a kind of truth-seeking activity, which is trying to add more complexity, more reality, and more validity to what is being narrated. And the more that conversation carries on, again, in a good faith and honest way, the better off one's going to be.
Jonathan, have you watched the Chris Marker essay film on this topic? Statues Also Die?
No, I haven't seen that one.
No, I haven't watched it either, but it's been on my list for a while. I was just curious if you've seen it. Yeah, in the 50s, he made an essay film about the African artifacts in France.
Yeah, in the Trocadero, right.
It seems like it was very contentious when it came out.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I mean, there's, you know, it puts me in mind that this recent work that's now made the rounds, I've seen it in two places, but Isaac Julian has this like beautiful film that's incorporates these images of the Musée de l'Homme and, you know, all of this artifacts, and it puts that into some of the historical context of the Harlem Renaissance and of Black history, both in Europe and in the United States, and does it in this kind of lyrical and interesting way. And I'm not doing a great job describing it because I haven't had a chance to like engage in depth. But you know, you know, we've known, you know, the legacies of modernism itself are, you know, is a legacy of the sort of a kind of intermixing and contact between these various different types of cultures with these various different artifacts playing significant roles. And no one does anybody a service in caricaturing them. Right. And I think that, again, my vote is always for more singularity, more substance, more complexity rather than less. That's my ethics.
Well, given the time here, let's move on to the least controversial interview we've ever had on the MO podcast. Sara Fitzmaurice, PR strategist.
You can never get a PR person to give you anything.
I know.
Professionals.
You wouldn't give a thing up.
I know. Usually when I edit these things, I look for like some little nugget that's just either like, you know, kind of controversial, kind of, you know, quippy, whatever, that I could put at the beginning of the episode as like my lead in. And, you know, with the Sara episode, I was like, wow, she is just like the consummate pro at like, you know, saying all kinds of great things without saying any, you know, without giving, you know, like anything necessarily that you want to latch onto and maybe argue with or whatever else.
Airtight, literally airtight. I was like, damn, you're good at what you do.
Totally. She's incredible. I mean, that's obviously why Fitz is one of the leaders, if not the leader in the space. But so Rocket, what did you think? What nuggets did you find in that interview?
No, I mean, the thing that just because of the like her how grounded she is in what she does and how much she understands the intricacies of like not misstepping, because that's literally what she's built her career on. When she like did have take, I was like, well, that is a hard-earned take. So, you know, just listening to her talk a little bit about AI, I was, you know, pretty fascinated in the way that she was just like, here's why relations cannot ever be replaced. And I just found that to be just for me the best takeaway. And I feel that way too, based on a different set of, you know, experiences, but just the way that she kind of like boiled that down, like, hey, here's how we develop relationships. The person that you're sitting with right now at the start of your career in 15, 20 years, they're going to be like running the show on something that you really want to participate in. So like it behooves you to like develop that relationship now, just like the long view. I just really appreciated her sort of, yeah, her perspective on that and how clearly that's served what she's built and how that's how she conducts her business. And it, you know, it just like feels very proof is in the pudding. Like you cannot fake good relationships, and AI certainly shall not be able to either.
I think that like really brings forth like an interesting insight, which is, you know, a lot of people are worried about job security in the world of AI and AI replacing people. You know, it's like, you know, every career of almost any kind, relationships are important. You know, as she said, you know, whoever you're, you know, maybe you're working with the, you know, some best boy grip on a movie today who ends up, you know, being the director of a film that you really want to be in, you know, 5 years from now or whatever it is. But maybe another thing to think about here is for all those people that are worried about AI replacing them is that any job function which requires a lot of relationships or a heavy focus on relationships is not likely to be displaced by technology. You know, like whether it's a, you know, partnership manager or, you know, really, you know, sort of enterprise salesperson or other things. Yes, some of those things will get picked apart by AI and the more menial tasks will get taken away, which is actually, you know, probably makes the job more interesting. But if you can find a job that relies on, you know, heavily on relationships and is very relationship driven, it's probably an area where you have some security for some time.
It's just bad news for all of the introverts and you know, spectrum oriented people out there.
Yeah. Everything's now is about personal brand building, which I can't stand doing. I think this podcast is like my best effort yet ever to have any, you know, put myself out in front of anything. Like I really, you know, it's never been something I enjoy. I quite, you know, if the podcast wasn't just so much fun and interesting to do, you know, I would probably shy away from it as well. I tried to, you know, like beef up my LinkedIn activity and it lasted like 3 weeks. I'm like, self promotion is just, yeah. So yeah, we'll see. The introverts and the shy are and people who, you know, I don't know if it's being humble or just not, you know, not wanting to put yourself out there. Those people are going to have a hard time in a world where, you know, everyone is an influencer and everything is about relationships and everything else gets displaced by technology. So.
Yeah, what I appreciated also about the conversation with Sara though is there's you know, the first thing that she asks and her team is asking is like what are you trying to do, right? What is the journey you're trying to get to? What's the point A that you're at? What's the point B you're trying to arrive at, right? And making it very concrete in terms of like you have to have a goal, you have to have a place that you're trying to get to, and you need to know what that is, and you need to know what it is that's going to help you get there, what kind of tools, what kind of vehicle it is that is the appropriate thing to do what you want to do. And you know, we all know this, that there's this kind of like, there is this large amorphous world, which is like the public, right? Is like the audience, is the like the potential reception for whatever enterprise or whatever activity is that you might be doing. So whether it is like you're trying to build your personal brand or you're trying to get your writing out there, or, you know, you've got a product that you're trying to put in front of potential purchasers, you've got a service that you're trying to, you know, get out there, or anything. It's a political campaign, right? I mean, we're being inundated with it right now in the United States because of the, you know, every political campaign. This one is now even more, we'll have spent even more money on this activity of, you know, campaign communications, right? Advertising, media outreach, text messages, right? Just like, so there's this like the world of mediated comms that is about trying to like reach other human beings, right? It's like trying to tell somebody something that you think is of import or something that they might find value in. And that is like so hard to do. um, beyond the scope of one's kind of like immediate context, right? It's like you have those relationships, and just like you said, relationships may become immensely important, but it's like the people who have the Rolodex and like they can send an email and make a telephone call to somebody else who will pick up their phone and be able to communicate some message, like those become hugely influential, hugely important people, right? And the rest of it that's cheap, which is like, sending out a billion emails over, to hope that one of them gets through, or which I'm still shocked by, all the direct mail that ends up in my mailbox, right, from various different people that are like, oh, I still, printing this thing on this piece of cardboard that's going to end up in your mailbox is still going to be an effective way to let you know about what we do. Everybody's just like trying to figure out how to do it, how to connect with more people. And it's like, there's something, I have to say, like immensely depressing about that as well. But also, kind of amazing that's such, you realize like why it's such a huge business in a certain sense, like why it is like so fundamental in such a big business. And it put me in mind too, was like, again, back to the network thing. Back when I did a lot more work with Art Review magazine, and Art Review publishes this issue every November called the Power 100 issue, right? Which like presumed to rank the 100 most powerful people in the art world, right? Everything from museum directors to gallerists to artists and things like that. And it's actually now an interesting artifact to go back and look at and see how the sensibilities around what made for power changes over time, right? Year to year, it's a little bit difficult to notice, but like you look at like a 10-year difference and it's like, oh, at one moment it was like all of these fancy dealers and collectors were at the top. And then the next moment it's like all of these fancy artists are at the top and thinkers and other people. And there's been a real kind of shift in the way that people think about that sensibility. But I remember for a lumber time to be on these telephone calls where people are like, well, how are we defining power this year? What does it mean? What does it mean to be powerful in this world? And my definition was always like, all right, in the ranking, is the person above you someone whose telephone call you will take, and the person below you is the person whose telephone call that will take your telephone call, right? Like who gets shunted to voicemail and who gets an immediate pickup, right? And it's like that goes to this kind of like network sensibility that you were just describing, pretty firmly, right? It's like, all right, who can you make a telephone call to and have them pick up your phone? And you may have a bunch of like fancy people in your address book in order to like show off at the bar or the cocktail party, be like, like a Hollywood agent being like, you want to call Tom Cruise right now? Call him right now. Call Tom Cruise right now. Let's get on the phone. It's like some like BS thing. But more importantly is like, if you make that phone call, does that person actually pick up, on ring 2 or ring 3? Or do you get voicemail, or you're just like bullshitting?
Yeah. I was going through my contacts the other day for some reason, or looking for somebody to call or something like that. And yeah, I've got Sam Altman's phone number in my phone because we chatted on the phone one time. But yeah, I don't think Sam's picking up necessarily when I call him without letting him know why I'm calling or anything like that.
You're totally using that at various different cocktail parties and meetups. You're like, oh, hold on, I got to call Sam. So call from Sam. Hold on.
Exactly.
And you're like you're showing the like.
Going back to what you were saying about Sarah asking, when people have PR goals, like what is it exactly you're trying to do? Like why are you trying to do it? We asked her if she would, take on the task of trying to bring Burning Man more into the institutional art world. And that was the first thing she said. It was like, I guess the first thing we'd want to know is like, why? Why do you want to be part of the institutional art world? Like, why would you care about that? Of course, we don't know the answer to that, and it doesn't seem to necessarily be an effort on their part to do that. But yeah, I think that's interesting. It's like any marketing effort. You should always start with sort of your objectives and your goals. But yeah, there's probably a much deeper exploration of the why when you're doing PR and things like that. Just if you really want to hit it out of the park.
Yeah, but I think it's like really important because I think Joey and Rocket, that's a conversation that you just don't hear from people all that much. I mean, we've had a conversation with artists about they want to market their work better, they want to show in this place, or we've had this conversation. It's like, oh, I want to get picked up by a blue chip gallery. Why? Like, what are the conditions that you're looking for from these various different places that you think are the end all and be all? I need a gallery in this city. I need a gallery. Like, why? What are the actual goals that you were trying to reach? And is that the only mechanism by which it's going to happen? Right? Are there other mechanisms by which to do this, or are there other things that you want that actually don't line up with what these activities or these efforts that you're going to making are. And I got to be honest, like sometimes it's very hard for an individual to ask those questions of themselves, or it's hard for a founder to ask those questions of their own company, right? It's like sometimes that sort of lean startup model where it's like, all right, you have to like have these, ask the 5 whys every time. It's like, why is that a problem? Well, so and so did this. Why did that person do X? Well, because of this. Well, why did that happen? Well, because of that. And it's not until you've gotten to like 5 whys that you're getting to some sort of root issue or challenge or problem that you can then solve. And you have conversations with these leaders in the art field, or someone like Sara, who's I think largely in like a constant kind of consulting problem solving role for a lot of her clients, which is why it's cultural strategy and not just public relations, right? Public relations might just be just like handling a certain kind of comms things, but cultural strategy is like helping people think through what it is that they're trying to do and asking them those questions and being a little relentless in getting them to answer, just below the surface. Because on the surface, everything could look kind of the same, right? Oh, the problem is that we don't have enough followers on Instagram. The problem is that we don't have enough. We need more members to our museum. The problem is like we need to get invited to these art fairs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the question is like, what is the ultimate goal, right? Where are you going for?
Yeah, I mean, like that goes back to the artist thing, saying I want to sign with a blue chip gallery is like an actor saying I want to sign with William Morris. But, at the end of the day, if you are, a tier C actor signed with William Morris, you're probably actually going to get a whole lot less parts or auditions than if you are a bigger fish in a smaller pond, working with like an agent
Sure.
who's really really hungry and trying to prove themselves. We talk about this with artists all the time. We had a friend, our artist in Australia, who works with one of the best gallerists in Sydney, and obviously that would make them one of the best in Australia. But that person has like no international ambitions whatsoever. They're very happy running this very nice gallery in Sydney. It's they've been at it a long time. They're already been out. And so here you have somebody who's working with one of the best galleries, but that person doesn't have the same drive and motivation as a earlier gallerist who really does want to expand and grow their presence, and maybe is a little hungrier, has ambitions beyond just having the cool gallery in the town that they live in. So I think it is important to ask yourself like, what is my goal to sign with a gallery and then I'm done? Because if signing with a gallery isn't the end of the value chain you're looking to to put together, then you really have to get deeper. Like, oh no, I want it because I want my paintings to go for higher prices so that I can make more money while doing the same amount of work, and I want to sell more work so that I have more stability and can afford some finer things in a bigger studio or whatever it is. And then the question is, okay, so if those are the actual goals, then is signing with a major gallery like actually the best route to achieving those things? And it might not be, right?
Yeah, that's right.
What else? Did Sara play it so safe that we don't have anything to pick apart here?
It's very hard.
Honestly, yeah.
Yeah.
It was masterclass. I was like, whoa.
Yeah. I also appreciate it that I think it's worth pointing out is that I think her willingness to work at the kind of at the limits of the art world. She's been in it for a long time, but like working with new digital arts, NFT projects, Web3 projects. I mean, working with Rafiq Anadol is not like any big risk at this point. Given the kind of reception of that artist's work and the exposure in museums and everything else. But working with a new generation of sort of digital first activities, Web3, AI based, generative artists, however you want to describe what it is that the post, COVID era ushered in for many people, I think is interesting, because I think there are a lot of PR firms that, especially in the art and cultural space, who would see them see their remit as working with more and more situated actors, right? Like they want to work with the museums and the galleries and maybe a handful of individual artists who are already established, because that clientele kind of already helps burnish and establishes their reputation as a kind of central player within this space. And so I can, I can tell you that even from some of the smaller, younger PR firms that I still get pitches from, it's always galleries, museums, and very kind of known entities. And I appreciated that Sara's firm and that she is taking, I think, not more risks, but is willing to be adventuresome at the borders of what is within the established art world. Now, listen, she's got plenty of established clients, so you can afford to take that out for a walk, right? When you've got a density of people that are well established in your client base, you can afford to take your reputation out for a walk on some of these, more at this point marginal characters. But it also means you may be opening up new and interesting worlds for people, and it may actually serve to benefit your established clientele when there's this whole new range of contacts and interesting people to put into dialogue with one another. And I think that's one of the key things that firms like Sara's do, which is kind of like what the big agencies and entertainment do, is create opportunities from within inside their walls for their clients with one another, right? That's the network that they can look to very quickly, because you've got a lot of diverse and interesting people doing projects inside of your agency structure. And so you can put those projects together more easily than you can with people who are working outside of that structure.
I think I've worked with a few PR agencies, but most of the really good PR that I've gotten for my companies has been, through my own outreach to journalists. And the one thing I've learned is that, there has to actually be a story, right? Like, like you can't just like make up something that's mildly interesting and like go out and try to peddle this and get somebody to write about something that isn't going to resonate with their audience or isn't in any way new. And so, I think like, choosing to work with some of these like digital, artists or organizations, or some of these sort of like, cutting edge technology people in the art world, there's a couple of interesting things there. I mean, first off, it's new, and it's easier to like come up with things to talk about when it's not the same old, hey, we're having an exhibition, that we're working with this artist that's, already have 50 institutional exhibitions or whatever. There's new, things to talk about. There's advancements in technology that are interesting. Like there's actual stories there that don't have to sort of be like, created out of an otherwise, kind of weak narrative. But the other thing that might be kind of interesting from a strategic standpoint for Sara and Fnnch Co. is that working with these organizations who are likely to get press in, maybe some of the same places that she has relationships, but certainly in other publications that are a little, outside of the art world or on the fringes of the art world. It's nice strategically to have interesting stories with which you can go build new relationships with new outlets, with new publications and things like that. So it's actually, I think, quite wise, that not only is she kind of taking these things that maybe other people wouldn't, because they feel like, well, I don't really have the contacts in that space. Well, if the stories are interesting, you can go make contacts in that space. And so that might actually be like a really interesting thing to think about is your ability to leverage these new, cutting edge technologies and artists and things like that to expand the universe that your PR firm operates within. Well, we said we were going to maybe talk a little bit about the opening of the ICA, but I think we're coming up on time here. Let's not kill the hour and a half time slot here, and let's just get Ethan Beard to come on the show. What do you think?
Sounds good.
All right, so Rocket, thank you for coming on the show, as always. Maybe next time we'll be doing a recap with Ethan Beard. Actually, the next two episodes we have, so we interviewed a longtime acquaintance of mine, Jeff Yasuda, who not only founded Blip.fm and Feed.fm, which are two companies in the music space, but also has a band that recently, with Ethan Beard, believe it or not, who helped to open the ICA. He has a band with Ethan Beard, and they just signed a record deal with Color Red, which represents the Gray Boy All-Stars, and I'm missing the other ones. He mentioned Sharon Jones, but I didn't know that they were on Color Red. Sharon Jones is amazing. Unfortunately, rest in peace, Sharon Jones passed away a couple of years ago, but anyway, so he's in very good company on the Color Red label. And then what's the other one that we just did? Who did we just talk to, John? Oh, Melissa Kelly Wolf.
Melissa Kelly Wolf.
from the Art Funders Forum and MCW projects, and her new foray into some pretty heavy executive coaching for CEOs and CDOs of museums and other institutions. So already got 2 in the can. We'll have our 3rd one recorded soon enough. Maybe it'll be Ethan Beard, and then those will be the 3 for the next roundtable. So Rocket, thanks for coming on the show again.
Thanks
Jonathan,
for having me.
as always, good to
Cool.
see you. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.